Well, hello and welcome, friends. It's your boy Sultan Skinny, Saeed of all that's lean and politically unclean. While it is easy to dismiss Arabia as just a peninsula of sand, this analysis fails to acknowledge the water that surrounds it. With a calm seasonal ocean current, the Indian Ocean is not only one of the easiest waterways to travel on, but for most of human history, it has been home to the single most important trade network on Earth. Since antiquity, Indian Ocean trade has connected the world's largest economies, transporting goods from places as far apart as China and Zimbabwe. The Arabian Peninsula sits at a very important crossroads in this vast maritime network, as it lies between Africa and India via the sea, and the Indian Ocean and Mediterranean via the land. Being at such a centralized location, Arabia has also served as a migrating launching pad for thousands of years, with seasonal immigrants from Africa, Persia, and India living on the peninsula and mixing with the locals. So, despite a mostly desolate landscape, Arabia has been able to maintain a rich assortment of different cultures, cities, and nations. The peninsula's geography is central to human travel and trade, making it one of the most strategically important locations in the world. And now that its people, the Arabs, were the creators and head figures of a new world religion, the Arabian Peninsula's significance was about to get a whole lot more attention. In the 7th century CE, the deserts of the Arabian Peninsula were occupied by a variety of different Arab tribes. Although all ethnically Arab, these people did not view themselves as being part of a larger national community. Instead, they found solidarity through their family and tribes, seeing each other more as enemies than fellow Arabs. But the Prophet Muhammad's revelation of following no other God but God would revolutionize the Arab identity. After taking the city of Mecca in 630 CE, the Prophet Muhammad would continue to spread his new religion among the different tribes of Arabia. By the time he died in 632 CE, the religion made its way across nearly the entirety of the peninsula, with dozens of Arab tribes not only accepting Islam, but also competing for its narrative. After the death of the Prophet, tribes from all over the peninsula suddenly had prophets of their own and began to rebel against the newly established caliphate, in which Muhammad's close friend and father-in-law, Abu Bakr, was the head of state. These rebellions would be quashed by the caliphate, but they serve as a reminder that although all Muslim, the Arabs would still be stuck in their old tribal ways, loyal more to the name of their father and sheikh than to any god or prophet. The religion of Islam may have given the Arabs a new national identity, a standardized language, and a sufficient political system, but the union and honor of the tribe would always remain to be their top priority. Although declared as a universal religion intended for all people, it must also be acknowledged that Islam still very much revolves around its Arab creators. God spoke to Muhammad in Arabic, and thus is the language all Muslims must recite the Quran in. The most important places of pilgrimage are Arabian cities, and the most honorific of titles can only be held by Arab figures, as the last prophet of this glorious new revelation was himself an Arab. With this new world order revolving around Arabian culture, places, and people, Arab tribalism was not only maintained, but amplified. In an empire and society that runs entirely on the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, the familial and tribal ties one has with God's messenger holds a great deal of political and spiritual value. Descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, or Sayyids, are among the first to be considered in leading an Islamic dynasty in both Sunni and Shia traditions. The tribe that has by far the most Sayyids are the Banu Hashim, as they are members of the very clan Muhammad belonged to. All over the Islamic world, the Banu Hashim have utilized their bloodline to legitimize the establishment of their own dynasties and empires. These include the medieval Abbasids and Fatimids, as well as the modern Moroccan Alawites and Jordanian Hashemites. Although members of the same tribe, the Banu Hashim are not a unified force. You see, as generations progress, different clans start to emerge from the different patriarchs of the tribe, with one's father's family eventually competing and fighting with another. This has been the case with Arab tribes for millennia, but in the new political reality that is Islam, these tribal feuds were now beginning to have theological implications. Tribal conflicts over the title of caliph, emir, or imam disguise themselves under the veil of sectarianism, with different religious parties rallying against the mainstream establishment with their own legitimate leader. This is most prominent within the Shia sect of Islam, where being a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad guarantees you political and often divine status. In fact, every sect of Shi'ism is formed and named on the basis of which imam's lineage is deemed the most legitimate. Sunni dynasties can also suffer from tribalist politics, but the Shias have always been the most active in asserting their religious brand. Different Shia movements promoting their own distinct sect and dynasties have always been prevalent throughout the Islamic world, but by far the most extreme example are the Qaramatians. Originally founded in the city of Kufa as an Ismaili movement, the Qaramatians found themselves mobilizing under the leadership of Abu Sa'id al-Janabi, a Persian merchant who claimed descent from the royal Sasanian family. The Qaramatians advocated a brand of Ismailism that was messianic, believing in the arrival of a rightfully guided figure known as Al-Mahdi. As the Qaramatians waited, they would prepare for the arrival of the Messiah, creating a society based on equality and reasoning. In the aftermath of the Zand rebellion, the Qaramatians would come out from the underground and conquer the island of Bahrain, from which they would establish their new utopian society. They rejected and rebelled against the established rulers of the Abbasid Caliphate, and even their fellow Ismaili Fatimids, who had declared their founder, Abdullah Billah, as Al-Mahdi. Abu Sa'id's son, Abu Tahir al-Janabi, initiated what some historians call a century of terror, in which the Qaramatians expanded their territorial reach and raided cities in caravans. Although they claimed to have established a divine socialist utopia, the Qaramatian Empire was in reality far more criminal than just. The economy was completely reliant on the exploitation and trading of slaves, profiting more on what they could take from others as opposed to producing anything themselves. Most notoriously, the Qaramatians constantly raided and massacred pilgrims making the Hajj, and in 930 CE sacked the cities of Mecca and Medina, destroying the holy Zamzam well and stealing the black rock of the Kaaba. This act sent shockwaves across the Muslim world as the holiest cities and items were just violated and stolen. The Qaramatians held the black stone for ransom until the Abbasids paid a hefty annual tribute. After buying back the stone, the Abbasids decided to establish a semi-autonomous protectorate around the Hijaz that would administer and protect the two holy cities. This small state would be known as the Sharifat of Mecca, in which a Sharif of the Banu Hashim tribe served as the official guardian of the two holy cities. While the Sharifat would survive for nearly 1,000 years under the rule of various Islamic empires, the Qaramatians that inspired its establishment would not last long after their daring act of defiance. Convinced that he had found the Mahdi that his empire had been waiting for, Abu Tahir turned over his title as emir to a young Persian man by the name of Abul Fadl al-Isfahani. Claiming to be a descendant of Sasanian royalty, the Mahdi was in fact far more interested in reinstating Zoroastrianism than actually being a Muslim messiah. His rule consisted of bringing back Zoroastrian traditions, burning Islamic texts, and even executing members of Bahrain's nobles, including members of Abu Tahir's family. After suffering 80 days of his apocalyptic reign, Abu Tahir would execute his messiah under the pretext of being a false Mahdi. This embarrassingly disastrous turn of events spoiled any and all reputations the Qaramatians had with the Muslim community, and they would begin to see their territory and tribute disappear. The empire would fall in 1076 CE, after Arab tribes, aided by the Seljuk Turks, captured the island of Bahrain and established their own emirate. Many other Arab dynasties would rule the region of Greater Bahrain, but none would be as powerful or notorious as the Qaramatians. The wealth and influence that comes with controlling the Hejaz and Persian Gulf is definitely impressive for Arab empires, but it is nowhere near as impactful as ruling the coasts of South Arabia. By having access to the Indian Ocean, South Arabia is not only one of the major trading hubs of the world, but it is also one of the most important epicenters of Muslim civilization. You see, the people of South Arabia were some of the first to accept the religion of Islam, with the Prophet Muhammad himself personally proselytizing the region. With its access to the sea and vast trading networks, South Arabians were among the first to export the religion of Islam to other lands, with missionaries reaching the Horn of Africa, India, and even China, all within the Prophet's lifetime. In fact, it is the countries surrounding the Indian Ocean that the vast majority of Muslims call home, which not only means that Islam spread far more through trade than through the stereotypical sword, but it also means that the vast majority of pilgrims performing Hajj would have to enter Arabia via its southern shore. The geostrategic importance of South Arabia was very well known in the Muslim world, with imperial dynasties such as the Ayyubids, Seljuks, and Fatimids vying for control of the region. However, occupying South Arabia was always difficult for imperial powers, as the different Arab tribes who inhabited the region not only fought for their independence, but also established their own mighty empires. Unlike most of the peninsula, much of South Arabia's land is fertile, with its various mountain chains and proximity to the monsoons providing the region with a consistent source of fresh water. This of course allows the people living here to grow their own crops, feeding themselves as well as exporting products abroad. Crops such as dates, peaches, frankincense, and the highly addicting cat leaf gave South Arabia an economic edge that the rest of the peninsula just can't compete with. But being in proximity to great geography isn't enough for an Arab tribe to truly distinguish themselves from the rest of their fellow Arabs. In the age of Islam, a true Arab dynasty must champion its own Islamic sect. Islamic history is often dominated by the rivalry between the two major sects of Sunniism and Shi'ism, but in the aftermath of the first fitna came the emergence of a third branch of Islam. After the Caliph Ali initiated a peace treaty with his Umayyad rivals, a portion of his army defected and turned on him, becoming a notorious extremist militant group known as the Khawarij. The Khawarij didn't believe that it should be up to mortal men to decide the fate of a conflict through arbitration. Instead, they believed that only God can determine a victor by battling to the death. With Ali choosing to go against the will of God, the Khawarij revolted against his authority and assassinated him. During the reign of the Umayyads, the Khawarij continued to rebel against the Caliphate establishment, believing that it is their religious duty as Muslims to overthrow their rulers if they are impious and sinful. It is from this movement that a man by the name of Abd Allah ibn Ibad would develop the Ibadi sect of Islam. Although named after Ibn Ibad, this new religious sect would be led and championed by a man named Jabir ibn Zayd al-Azadi. Al-Azadi was a member of the Banu Azid Uman, an influential merchant tribe that engaged in Persian Gulf commerce. At the turn of the 8th century, the Azid Uman and much of the Ibadi community were exiled from their main center of Basra. Under the leadership of Al-Azidi, the Ibadis and their mostly Azid Uman members would find sanctuary in the Al-Hajar mountain range of southeast Arabia. what we now call Oman. After the fall of the Umayyad Caliphate, the Ibadis were able to establish an independent imamate in the city of Nizwa. Unlike the Shias, the Ibadis do not believe that their imam must be a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, but rather should be elected based on their religious and military merit. Ibadis also do not share the notion that their imam is the default ruler of the Muslim community like the Caliph. Instead, they believe that different Muslim communities have the right to govern themselves independent from one another. These sets of beliefs not only make Ibadism an entirely different sect from that of the two main denominations, but it also makes the nation of Oman an exceptional one, as it is the only country in the world with a majority Ibadi population. The Imamate of Oman built its economy around the cultivation of mainly dates and frankincense. However, the exportation of these goods was always difficult for them to control. On the other side of the mountains are the northern coastal regions of Al-Batina and Al-Sharqiyya, where the port cities of Sohar, Sur, and Muscat can be found. Located right between the Persian Gulf and Arabian Sea, these coastal cities have for millennia served as Oman's main trading ports. But for most of the country's history, it has never been able to fully control them. Being a nation of mountains and desert, the Omani Imamate could never really establish a navy to protect its ports and sea traffic from invaders. Over the centuries, the coastal strip of Oman has been occupied by a variety of different imperial powers, such as the Buyids, Seljuks, and the powerful city-state of Ormuz. In the early 1500s, the Portuguese navy, led by Alfonso de Albuquerque, invaded and occupied much of the Persian Gulf and Omani coast, establishing large fortresses that solidified its presence as the region's dominant naval power. Other empires like the Ottomans and Safavids would compete with the Portuguese with relative success, but the fortified ports of Oman remained to be firmly under their rule, serving as one of the colonial empire's main trading centers for over a century. But in 1624, the elected Imam Nasir bin Mushrid al-Yaruba would make the expulsion of the Portuguese the top priority of not just his leadership, but also the legacy of the newly established Yarubid dynasty. By uniting the various tribes of the Imamate and building up his army and navy, the Yarubids were able to conquer all of the Portuguese-held cities of Oman by 1650. However, the Portuguese would not so easily give up one of their most important trading ports. After their expulsion, the Portuguese sent numerous naval raids against the Yarubids in the hopes of gaining back their lost colonies. The raids would result in failure, with many Portuguese galleons being captured by the Yarubid forces, who used their newly built-up navy to chase the Portuguese out of the Indian Ocean. Throughout the later half of the 17th century, the Yarubids would capture and raid Portuguese fortresses across India and Africa, essentially colonizing the colonies of their former colonizer, which is an exceptionally impressive feat considering that the world's most powerful navy for over a century was defeated by one that just started to exist. The Yarubid Empire would replace the Portuguese as the Indian Ocean's new naval powerhouse, controlling a vast network of sea trade routes that made them exceptionally wealthy. As well as controlling a rich trade network of incense, ivory, spices, and slaves, the Omani Empire also developed its own shipping industry in the city of Sur, becoming famous for constructing some of the world's finest dhow ships. The Yarubid dynasty was a prosperous one, but in 1718, the Imamate suffered a long succession crisis that would last for over 20 years. The conflict stunted the growth of the empire, and the tribal divisions got so bad that the Yarubids asked for the assistance of the Persian king Nader Shah to stabilize the region. However, in 1742, Nader Shah decided that the Omanis were unfit to rule their land, occupying the coastal cities and bringing the Imamate under the rule of his empire. After hearing news of Nader Shah's death in 1747, the governor of Sohar, Ahmed bin Said al-Busayri, would lead the Omanis to liberation from the Persian forces. The Omani Council would later elect al-Busayri as the new Imam in 1749, ushering in the beginning of the Busaid dynasty that continues to rule Oman to this very day. Oman under the Busaids would continue to be a regional maritime power for the remainder of the 18th century, attracting the highly invested business and political interests of the British Crown, which to this day continues to have very strong relations with the country. Oman is most definitely one of Arabia's most intriguing and successful nations, but its historical impact on the peninsula remains to be dwarfed by its often neglected next-door neighbor. Cornered by the Gulf of Aden and Red Sea, the region of Yemen lays just 40 kilometers away from the African Rift Valley, making it not only one of the main routes in and out of the African continent, but in fact the oldest route, as it is here that the first humans ventured out of Africa. The antiquity of Yemen is very well known among the Arab tribes, as they actually trace their ancestral origin to the ancient civilizations of the Sabaeans and Himyarites. The Adenites of northern Arabia often hog the spotlight of history due to being the line of which the Prophet claims descent from, but it is the Qatanis of Yemen that are considered by Arab genealogists to be the pure Arabs. Which is kind of ironic, considering that the Yemeni population is among one of the most diverse in the world, with admixtures of Arabian, African, and Indian DNA being very prevalent in their genetic makeup. This is because Yemen has always been a major destination for human migration, with merchants, immigrants, pilgrims, and travelers constantly visiting and often staying in the region. The Yemeni people are also known to travel themselves, with their tribes reaching every corner of the Muslim world. In fact, it is the Yemeni who are responsible for most of Islam's Indian Ocean commerce and proselytizing. Yemeni tribes have also played a major role in Islamic politics, as they were very involved in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and throughout history established their own Islamic dynasties, like the Banu Wazir of Oman and the Nazirids of Spain. With Yemen being of such strategic importance, the Yemenis would find themselves contending for the region not just with foreigners, but also themselves. The mountains that provide Yemen much of its water and arable land also prevent the establishment of a centralized state, as the highlands isolate the different tribes from one another's authority. This has resulted in Yemen mostly being fragmented into a collection of competing tribal city-states. And with Islam becoming a new political reality for the region, each dynasty had to champion its own sect. The first of these independent tribal nations to emerge were the Sunni Ziyabids, whose leaders were members of the Umayyad dynasty. The Ziyabids based themselves in the town of Zaybid, which has a great deal of significance to Yemen, as it is where the oldest mosque in the region can be found. However, this offshoot of the old Umayyad dynasty would find itself at odds with local Yemeni tribes, such as the Euphrids. Based in the cities of Sana'a and Shibam, the Euphrids are members of the Himyarite tribe that once ruled all of Yemen as a Jewish kingdom. However, the now Sunni Euphrids always found themselves warring with different Shia dynasties, especially the Zaydi Imamate of the Rasids. The House of Rasid claims descent from one of Ali's sons, and thus uses this lineage as a way to justify their authority in the town of Sada. Although unable to maintain much of its territory due to the military and economic strength of its rivals, the Rasids would prove to be quite resilient, as they would outlast their competition. The Ziyabids would be overthrown by the Ethiopian Najahids, and the Ismaili Sulayhids would replace the Euphrids as Sana'a's new overlords. With the Fatimids of Egypt occupying the Hijaz, the Sulayhids were emboldened by their fellow Ismaili Caliphate, becoming Yemen's most powerful ruling dynasty. The Sulayhids were members of the Hashid faction of the wider Banu Hamdan tribe, which for over millennia have been among the most dominant tribes of Yemen. But remember, being a member of the same tribe doesn't mean you're on the same side. After the Sulayhids moved their capital from Sana'a to the city of Jibla, other Banu Hamdan clans stepped up to become the supreme dynasty of Yemen. Sana'a would be occupied by the Hamdanids shortly after the move, and the Zurayyids of Aden, who were once vassals of the Sulayhids, would even surpass the influence and power of their former masters, establishing a strong confederacy that occupied nearly the entire southern coast of Arabia. In 1171, the Fatimid Caliphate that sponsored and promoted the influence of the Ismaili Banu Hamdan would fall to the rule of a Sunni leader by the name of Salah ud-Din. by 1174, Saladin's Ayyubid Empire would take full control of Yemen, with the help of his mostly Turkish army. The Ayyubids granted governorship of Yemen to a faction of its army known as the Razulids, who claimed descent from the ancient Khazanids, a North Arabian tribe confederacy that can trace its lineage to the Yemeni Banu Azid. However, if you were to ask the Zaydi Imamate, who throughout this whole time maintained their stronghold in Sada, they would tell you that the Razulids are nothing more than just Turks who want to legitimize their occupation of Yemen. Regardless of their lineage, the Razulids would become one of Yemen's most successful dynasties, as it ruled the entirety of southwest Arabia for over 200 years. During that time, the Razulids made their capital cities of Zaybid and Taiz some of the most spectacular cities of the medieval age. The wealth generated by trade was so immense that even the famous Chinese admiral Zhang He was in awe of the gifts granted to him by the Razulid king. But the Razulids couldn't maintain this prosperity forever, especially when the Mamluk Sultanate undermined its influence in the Hijaz. In 1454, after a series of revolts and insurrections, the Razulids would fall to the Banu Tahir, who continued to rule the region in a similar fashion as their predecessors. The Tahirids attempted to revive the lost wealth and prestige the Razulids had become known for, constructing bridges, irrigation canals, and madrasas to keep Yemen's cities thriving. However, with this revitalization of Yemen's former glory, the Tahirids faced internal and external competition. The Zaydi Imamate constantly raided and occupied the city of Sana'a, and the Mamluk Sultanate's armies overthrew the dynasty entirely in 1517. The Mamluk occupation of Yemen, however, was short-lived, as the Ottoman Empire conquered the Sultanate in the same year. The Ottomans would later establish Yemen as an administrative province of the empire, but the local Yemeni tribes made it difficult for them to exert full control of the region. After being elected, the Zaydi Imam al-Mansur al-Qasim rallied the Banu Hamdan tribes in an effort to oust their foreign occupiers. Although unsuccessful during his lifetime, his son, al-Muayyad Muhammad, would fully expel Ottoman forces out of Yemen by 1638, establishing a powerful Zaydi Imamate. The influence of this new Qasimid dynasty made Zaydiism one of the most prominent sects in South Arabia, which has resulted in modern-day Yemen having the largest Zaydi population in the world. Occupying such a vital geographic position, the Qasimids were a regional power, not only because of its trade networks, but also because of the monopoly it had on coffee. You see, coffee may have been discovered by the Oromos of Ethiopia, but it is in Yemen where the drink truly became a full-fledged industry. For over a century, Yemen completely controlled the cultivation and export of coffee, with its port cities of Aden and Mocha being flooded by merchants from all over the world. The revenue generated from this booming coffee trade made the Qasimids wealthy, and their cities some of the world's most spectacular. One thing in particular that made Yemeni cities stand out from the rest of the world were their residential towers. Made from mud and wood, these multi-story apartments continue to house much of Yemen's civilian population. In the walled city of Shibam, you can find the oldest standing high-rises in the world, with many of these structures dating back to the 16th century. With its fascinating high-rises and black liquid gold, the Qasimids were the UAE of its day, being one of the main destinations for business and commerce. But with success also comes envy. Aware of its market potential, Dutch merchants would sneak the coffee plant out of Yemen and bring it to their Indonesian colonies. Because of the island's excellent conditions for cultivating the crop, coffee from Java would come to replace Yemen as Europe's main caffeine provider. The loss of the coffee monopoly meant an increase in tax to make up for the lost profits, something that tribal members of the Confederacy were not too keen on accepting. Tribal schisms began to fracture the imamate as members of the Confederacy began to declare independence, such as the Abdali Sultanate of Aden. The Zaydi imamate would continue to inhabit the highlands of Yemen, but it was finding itself surrounded by the imperial grip of European empires, who, by the mid-1800s, divided the region of Yemen into a North Ottoman and South British colony. However, even with this imperial occupation, the Zaydi imamate continued to rule the mountains, being a major nuisance for the Ottoman Empire. Under the rule of the Al-Mutawakkil dynasty, the Zaidi Imamate of North Yemen would declare independence from the Ottomans in 1918. For decades, this over 1,000-year-old imamate would function as a sovereign nation alongside the modern states of the 20th century. But in 1962, the imamate saw an 8-year-long civil war that resulted in its complete overthrow. In its place came a new nation that, although still majority Zaidi, would govern its state through a very different ideology. A movement that would come to dominate much of the Arab world and serve as a new political alternative to the old ways of Islamic theocracy. You see, my friends, if the Arabs were to thrive in a changing world, they would have to set aside their ancient tribal differences and become a modern nation. Whatever that means. Next episode, we welcome the arrival of Arab nationalism, a revolutionary movement that would forever change the political dynamics of the Middle East and beyond. We will meet the minds behind the philosophy and examine the efforts made to make this ideology one of the most prominent in the Arab world, as well as touch on the challenges that complicate its realization.